What would you do if you came back to your cabin and found strangers in black tactical gear standing guard, blocking your door like they own the place? Before you could speak, your neighbor Lydia stepped out in her spotless white suit, smirking, claiming the cabin now belonged to the HOA. Her hired guards gripped their weapons tighter, daring anyone to take a step closer. Everything you're about to see turned into a showdown no one expected. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. And if you've ever been pushed to your breaking point by someone who thought they could walk all over you, you're going to feel this one in your chest. Stick with me till the end. And if you're ready for justice, hit like and subscribe so we stay connected. Cole stepped out of his truck with a week's worth of exhaustion in his body and a box of supplies in his arms, but the sight waiting for him ripped the breath from his chest. Two men in black tactical gear stood like statues at the edge of his porch, their hands resting on their belts, eyes locked on him like he was the intruder. Every muscle in his body tensed. He didn't speak at first. He just set the box down slowly, his jaw clenching as he stared at the men. They didn't move. Then the sound of heels clicking on the porch boards broke the silence, and Lydia appeared. Perfectly pressed white suit, flawless smirk, that look that had haunted Cole for months. She had been fighting to strip him of this land since the day she became HOA president, and now she stood there like a queen who'd finally conquered her enemy. She called out to him with a voice soaked in mock concern, telling him she was protecting HOA property. Her words cut like glass, each syllable meant to humiliate. Cole didn't move, didn't blink, just kept his eyes locked on hers as if daring her to finish. Lydia gestured at the two men, calling them her private security, saying they'd be here as long as it took to keep order. Rafe, the taller of the two guards, squared his shoulders, hand brushing his holster. Mason shifted his weight like a man who wasn't sure if this was worth the paycheck. Cole felt heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was what Lydia wanted, to see him snap, to give her something she could twist into another complaint, another fine. Not this time. His voice was low, even, but carried a weight that made Mason glance away. He told Lydia she had 5 seconds to get off his land. Lydia laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that made Rafe grin. She said this was no longer his land, that the HOA had voted and decided his cabin was a community hazard. Cole's fist tightened until his knuckles turned white. He could hear his father's voice in the back of his head, reminding him that this cabin was more than wood and nails. This was blood, sweat, and memory. He didn't take a step forward. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. His words were calm, deliberate, almost cold. "Bring everything. Now." Lydia's smirk faltered just for a second, but she straightened, telling her guards not to let him near the porch. Rafe stepped forward, blocking the steps. Mason's hand hovered near his sidearm, but never touched it. Cole slid the phone back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving Lydia's. Minutes stretched like wire pulled too tight. Then, faint at first, came the sound. A low growl of tires rolling over gravel. Louder. Closer. Rafe's expression flickered, just for a second. Mason shifted his stance and glanced toward the road. Lydia laughed again, louder this time, telling Cole that no one was coming to help him. Then came the single sharp blip of a siren. Quick. Final. The guard stiffened. Lydia's laugh cracked mid-breath. Cole's lips curved into the faintest smirk. Headlights swung across the drive, and a sheriff's truck rolled to a stop. The engine cut. The silence that followed was deafening. The driver's door opened, slow and deliberate. Sheriff Harlan stepped out, tall and steady, eyes already scanning the scene like he'd walked into a standoff he'd been expecting all along. Cole stood straighter, meeting Lydia's gaze across the space between them. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. Whatever game she thought she was playing, it was about to end. Sheriff Harlan's boots hit the dirt with a sound that made Rafe swallow hard. Mason took a half step back, waiting for orders that never came. Lydia's face had gone pale beneath the porch light, but her chin was still high, still trying to hold on to that last shred of control. Cole didn't move. He didn't speak. He just let the moment stretch, tension snapping in the air like a live wire. And that was when everything shifted. Sheriff Harlan stopped in front of Lydia, his presence filling the space like a wall. Cole crossed his arms, a slow, calm motion that made Lydia's hands twitch at her sides. The power had flipped, and everyone could feel it. The night felt like it was holding its breath. Somewhere behind them, a dog barked once and then went silent. Mason's eyes darted between Lydia and the sheriff. Rafe's jaw tightened, but even he didn't dare move first. Cole's smirk didn't fade. Lydia's perfect white suit looked less perfect now, dust settling on the hem as if mocking her. Then the sheriff spoke, his voice deep and steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. And in that single moment, Lydia's confidence cracked for the first time. Everything that came next would decide who owned this land and who was about to lose everything. Sheriff Harlan faced them like a verdict that had finally arrived, and Lydia tried to smile through it, the kind of smile that begs the world to believe what even she no longer does. He asked for documents with the patience of a man who already knew the answer. Rafe's eyes slid to Mason. Mason stared at the ground, the silence saying louder than any excuse that there was nothing to show. How fast would you back out if the badge asked you for the truth you don't have? Lydia pivoted to charm as if flipping a switch, calling Cole a problem tenant, calling the cabin a hazard, calling her guards necessary. The words were smooth until they hit Harlan's face and died there. Cole didn't flinch. He told her the deed carried his father's name and now his. And he said it like a promise he had no intention of breaking. Rafe stiffened. Mason's mouth opened and closed, a man caught between paycheck and conscience. Harlan gave them one chance to walk. No speeches, no threats, just a clean line on the ground. Rafe's hand hovered near his holster and went no further. Mason licked his lips and asked Lydia if she had the permits filed. Lydia said she did, and her voice rattled on the last word like a key turning the wrong way in a lock. The air changed. Everyone felt it. This was no longer bluff versus bluff. This was record versus rumor, oath versus noise. Cole stepped forward until his shadow touched the bottom step and said that every letter, every fake rule, every midnight threat had led to this moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Lydia snapped back that the neighborhood wanted peace, and Cole answered that peace was the first casualty the day her fines started targeting widows and veterans. A murmur broke from Mason that he hadn't signed up for this kind of job. Rafe muttered to hold the line. Hold the line against what? He did not say. Harlan reached inside his jacket and pulled out an envelope that looked too light to carry so much weight. He had a file number, a stamped complaint, dates and names that did not blink. He said the board had been notified that a hearing was pending and that showing up with private muscle on disputed land was a choice with consequences. Lydia's breath stuttered. She insisted the board stood behind her. Cole asked which board, the one on paper or the one curated in her living room with wine glasses and whispered votes. Rafe finally spoke, low and sharp, asking Lydia why she said everything was squared away when clearly it wasn't. Lydia told him to remember his contract. Rafe laughed once without humor and said a contract that disappears when the law shows up isn't a contract. It's bait. Mason took another step back, his boots drawing a faint half-moon like he was erasing himself from the scene. Harlan turned to the guards and counted, not with numbers, but with patience, each heartbeat a chance to leave with dignity. Cole's hands opened at his sides, not submission but readiness, a calm that told everyone he had already decided not to lose this time. Lydia's eyes flashed with the fear that only visits people who believe they would never be told no. She ordered them to stand fast. The words rang brittle and fell apart at the edges. Cole said he remembered the day his father signed for the cabin and how the old man shook as if the paper weighed more than the roof it promised. He said he would not be the son who let that signature be laughed at by a committee that never built anything but problems. Mason whispered that this was getting bad. Rafe held position because sometimes pride is heavier than sense. How far would you go before you admit the ground under your feet isn't yours? Harlan's voice went quiet, and quiet from him sounded like thunder far away. Last warning. Lydia tried one more time, promising to produce documents tomorrow, promising the story would make sense if he just gave her tonight. Harlan said the law doesn't clock out because someone ran out of photocopies. Cole almost smiled. For the first time all year, the pressure in his chest lifted and something steadier took its place. Lydia threatened to call more security. Rafe said he wouldn't be part of any stunt that ended with cuffs. Mason said the pay wasn't worth it and stared at his own hands as if the answer were written there. Cole told Lydia she could keep fighting him or start fixing what she broke in this neighborhood. She called him a bully. He said bullies hide behind rules they won't follow themselves. The silence after that was thin as glass, and just as ready to shatter. Harlan nodded once, and the meaning landed like a stamp. Trespass confirmed. Stand down. Mason startled like a man waking from a bad dream. He took 2 steps back, then a third, then turned. Lydia shouted his name with a thread of panic that stripped the polish from every other word she'd used. Mason broke into a run, not fast, not proud, just done. Rafe stayed locked in place, the last pillar holding up a lie. His jaw worked, his eyes burned, his hand hovered over a weapon he knew he couldn't justify. He looked at Lydia for orders that would make sense, and found only a face cracking under its own mask. Harlan's hand settled near his holster, not a threat, a truth. Cole stood shoulder to shoulder with the badge, and for once the history on this land stood with them. Mason's footsteps faded. Lydia's voice shrank. Rafe didn't move. A bead of sweat traced a line down the side of his neck like a clock nobody could stop. Harlan waited him out, the way time waits out everyone. Cole's heart slammed, but steady, like a drum calling the end of a long march. Somewhere inside the story that brought them all here, a hinge turned. What would you do if the moment you'd been dreading finally arrived and asked you to choose what kind of person you are? Rafe inhaled as if the breath might save him, eyes flicking to the road where Mason had vanished and back to the sheriff who hadn't looked away once. Lydia whispered hold, and the words sounded smaller than the boy she used to be before power taught her a different language. Rafe's fingers twitched. He lifted his boot an inch, then set it down. And then nothing moved at all, as if the world were deciding in slow motion which way the balance would tip next. Rafe stood welded to the spot, pride fighting panic while the last of Mason's footsteps dissolved into silence, and Lydia's voice sharpened as she ordered him to stay, put as if the word alone could hold a wall that was already crumbling. Because what happens when the person paying you suddenly looks smaller than the problem she created? Cole didn't waste breath on victory. He carried months of letters and late-night threats like a weight he'd finally learned to lift, telling Lydia that the fines against the old veteran on Birch, the citations against the single mother with the broken fence, the meeting where she laughed about making examples out of people were not rumors, but scars. And how many scars does a neighborhood need before it remembers it has a backbone? Lydia shot back with polished lines about safety and standards, but the polish scraped off when Harlan took 1 step closer and asked a question so simple it felt like a verdict. Show proof, show authority, show anything that isn't fear in a white suit. And the way her mouth held still on the second beat told everyone the filing cabinet in her story had never actually existed, right? Cole kept going. Not loud, but relentless, naming dates and times. The night her board voted in her living room, while the official meeting never happened, the email chain she forgot to scrub where she called him a stubborn relic, the private messenger thread where Rafe was promised a cash bonus if the cabin went dark before winter, and how do you defend a plan that falls apart under a porch light? Rafe flicked his gaze at Lydia with a look that asked for a rescue she could not give, and something in him bent, the way metal bends before snapping. Because he had told his sister this was a straight post. Easy pay. No trouble. Then tonight arrived dressed like consequence. And who keeps standing when the ground hisses move? Harlan opened the envelope that waited like a storm in his pocket and read the file number, the scheduled hearing, the warning already mailed to the board, the witness statements attached, the prior complaints stacked like bricks, and the stillness that followed felt heavier than handcuffs. Because the law had spoken long before the siren ever did. Didn't it? Lydia tried to talk over it, layering control on top of panic, insisting that the board had emergency powers and temporary custody over problem properties. But Harlan asked who signed the authority and on what statute. And silence is a poor statute when a badge is asking the question, wouldn't you agree? Cole cut in with a memory that didn't ask permission to hurt. His father teaching him how to set a hinge straight, saying a door that hangs true won't slam in the wind. And tonight, every loose screw from Lydia's rulebook rattled in public because the wind had names, faces, receipts, and debts to collect. Can you feel that balance click? Rafe finally muttered that this wasn't what he signed up for, that armed posts on private land were a different animal than a night watch on a clubhouse. And when Lydia snapped back about loyalty, he laughed once without humor and said loyalty without law is just a costume. And why does the costume always rip the moment real work shows up? Harlan told him there was a path to walk away clean. And for a long beat, Rafe stood in that doorway raised between pride and wisdom. Then he took the first step back, slow, eyes still on Lydia, as if returning a badge she never gave him. Because sometimes quitting is the bravest form of staying intact, isn't it? Lydia's mask cracked. She fired orders that landed like paper darts against a brick wall, telling Rafe to resume position, telling Harlan this was intimidation, telling Cole his claim would be overturned in court by morning, and every sentence shrank as if the air itself refused to carry it. Because where do commands go when nobody chooses to catch them? Cole didn't celebrate. He asked Rafe how much Lydia owed him for the hours already worked, and the number came out small, the kind of small that makes a grown man feel invisible, and Rafe said the bonus would have made it right, and Harlan said bonuses don't cure crimes. And somewhere in that triangle a decision hardened. Can you see which way it points? Then the radio on Rafe's shoulder crackled with static and nothing else. And in a flash of hot shame, he tore it off and let it hit the step like a confession, the sound sharp enough to make Lydia flinch, and the way her eyes darted toward the drive told the truth her mouth would not admit, that her best plan now was distance, correct? She tried one last gambit, swearing she had a temporary title to the land, a resolution, a memo, a something, and Harlan's reply cut clean. If you had authority, you would have led with it. And Cole's mouth curved because justice doesn't need volume when it finally arrives. It just needs a place to sit, right? Rafe spoke to Cole without looking at him, saying this got bigger than a job, saying he knew the cabin meant more than wood to a man who could stand this still under pressure. And Cole answered that bullies teach us stillness because it's the only ground they cannot twist. And Lydia choked on a breath like the first time truth made it past her armor. Feel that sting? Harlan gave the last warning with a voice that held no theater at all. Leave now or be arrested for trespass with aggravating factors. And the phrase aggravating factors landed like a door slamming from the inside. Because those are the words that make even a stubborn story quiet down to listen, don't they? For a fraction of a second, Lydia stared at Rafe like he might still choose her, and Rafe stared back like a man who had finally taken his name back from someone else's pocket. Then he stepped off the porch and away from the fight. And in that motion, the entire narrative lurched. Who's left to stand when everyone stops pretending? Lydia's breath turned ragged. She told Harlan he would regret humiliating her, told Cole that neighbors would thank her when the cabin was gone, told herself that tomorrow still belonged to her. But tomorrow has never saved anyone from tonight, and tonight was already counting down. Do you hear the seconds dropping? Cole said nothing. His presence beside the sheriff wrote a sentence stronger than any speech, and the message hammered into the moment that this land had a spine again, and spines make bullies do the math they have been avoiding. What does it cost to keep losing? Lydia looked from the badge to the man she could not break and back again, her certainty draining through 100 hairline fractures, and the command she reached for failed to form because the choice had stripped down to two hard edges, surrender or run, and every story she'd told about herself hated both. So which poison does pride pick when the lights don't blink? Harlan's palms settled near the holster, not challenge, simple procedure, and Rafe, now outside the blast radius, watched with a face that had finally learned the difference between force and authority, and the only sound left was Lydia's quickening breath as she pivoted on a heel that wobbled for the first time all year, and in that wobble the ending revealed itself like a trail in snow. Can you see it forming? She glanced at the road, measured the distance, weighed the eyes on her, and rage flared across her face in a color that looked too young for the mask she wore. Then without warning she spun toward the drive, fabric snapping, breath tearing, legs firing. Every step an admission that the crown had always been borrowed, and as Rafe cursed and launched after her, Cole and Harlan stood unshaken, the law behind them, and the story finally tipping. So what happens when the one who made everyone run is the first to flee? Lydia ran first, not a measured retreat, but a break in the dam, heels slashing the dirt as if speed could edit the last 5 minutes out of existence, and Rafe jolted after her with a curse that sounded like a man admitting he'd bet on the wrong queen. Because what else do you call it when the enforcer follows the exit sign his boss just became? Cole didn't chase. He didn't need to. He and Harlan stood like the end of a road that finally ran out of lies. Two fixed points watching the story rewrite itself in real time. Because how many months had this neighborhood waited to see the bully blink first? Lydia threw a command over her shoulder that broke apart before it reached anyone willing to catch it. Rafe shouted back that the job was done and not in the way she promised. and the line that had braced his spine all evening snapped with a noise only pride can hear. Because what good is muscle when the contract turns to smoke? Harlan spoke into the radio with that steady cadence that never begs, requesting units and documentation, and the calm of it burned hotter than any raised voice. Because the most dangerous sentence of the night wasn't a threat. It was a checklist. Do you know the power of a man who only speaks in facts? Lydia stumbled at the truck door, palms slapping metal, her breath chopping into jagged pieces as she hissed at Rafe to move faster. And for a heartbeat, he didn't move at all, torn between the woman who hired him and the men who hadn't needed force to win. Because who looks good running when the badge doesn't bother to follow? Cole could have laughed. He didn't. He carried the weight of a father's handwriting through the silence and let it speak for him. The kind of quiet that draws a line between torment and tomorrow. And even Rafe felt it, because he dragged Lydia up with a look that apologized to no one and everyone at once. Does regret ever arrive on time? The engine turned over with the panic of someone trying to outpace a record that already exists. Harlan read plate numbers in a low rhythm and tagged the moment for the file that would follow them home. And the truth of that landed in Lydia's face like a cold verdict, because where do you run when the paper trail runs alongside you? Rafe threw the truck in reverse, overcorrected, threw it back in drive, and the tires grabbed as if yanked by an invisible hand. And Lydia pointed at Cole like the last threat of control was to name a villain who didn't need a costume. But villains don't stand beside the law when the lights arrive, do they? The truck fishtailed and shot down the road, taillights jittering like a pulse that knows it's being counted. Harlan keyed the radio again, calm as a closing signature, requesting a citation team, a civil standby, photographs, witness statements, the architecture of accountability assembling piece by piece. Can you feel the scaffolding of justice locking into place? For a long breath, only the quiet held them. Rafe's abandoned radio lay near the step like an oath someone finally refused to keep. Lydia's echo faded to nothing. Cole exhaled a year of pressure and stood taller without moving an inch, because sometimes victory isn't a roar, it's the first calm breath you trust. Harlan glanced at Cole, not as savior, not as audience, but as a neighbor who understands cost, and said the line that cut through the relief before it grew careless. This isn't the end. It's the last warning they'll ever get, and the weight of that truth felt almost holy. Doesn't real peace always arrive with rules? Cole answered with a small nod that carried the ache of long nights and the stubbornness of a man who chooses home over noise. He told Harlan there would be more moves, that Lydia never played a game she didn't try to change mid-match. And Harlan said change all you want. The board doesn't lie when squares are numbered. They walked the porch like a crime scene without tape, Harlan noting positions, Cole marking the absence that felt louder than bodies, and every little detail became a nail in a house that would finally hold. Because when has a bully ever respected anything that wasn't recorded in ink? A text buzzed on Cole's phone from a number he didn't recognize. 3 words so clipped they read like a dare. Watch your back. He showed Harlan, and the sheriff's eyes cooled, not frightened, focused, the way a medic looks at a wound he knows how to close. Because threats always sound smaller once logged, right? Another buzz, a forwarded flyer from a neighbor. Emergency board session tonight. Agenda blurred but the message loud, narrative recovery, image control, blame assignment disguised as policy talk. And the timing had the sour taste of someone trying to outrun an affidavit. How many meetings does it take to erase a siren? Harlan told Cole to keep his phone ready and his comm steady. He said witnesses grow braver in daylight, but courage tonight matters most. And Cole agreed with the kind of certainty you can't coach, the kind born from carrying an address like a vow. When did stubbornness become such a gentle word for love? A car slowed at the far end of the road, lingered, then rolled on. The kind of slow pass that says someone is counting faces and parking spots. And Harlan clocked it without turning his head, the way professionals notice weather before anyone else brings in the chairs. Do you see how the next chapter starts even as the last one closes? Cole lifted the box of supplies he'd dropped at the beginning, felt the ache in his arms finally mean something good, and he laughed once, tired and clean, telling Harlan that tonight was the first time in months he felt like the place remembered his name. And Harlan said the place never forgot. It was waiting for the people to remember. Dispatch crackled, confirming units en route for documentation, confirming the plate capture, confirming the formal notice request to the board president of record. and Harlan repeated the last phrase with a dry edge that carried its own quiet promise. Because President of Record is not the same thing as President Tomorrow, is it? Cole looked down the road where the taillights had vanished, and then back at the steps where the radio still lay like a shed skin. He picked it up and handed it to Harlan, an artifact of a story that had just changed writers, and somewhere in that handoff the neighborhood's pulse steadied. Can you feel it slow to normal? Harlan clipped the radio to his belt and said they'd file, they'd serve, they'd let paper and consequence finish what courage started. And he added that people who run leave footprints all the way to the hearing, and footprints are loud when a judge is listening. Do you hear how the path already points forward? A distant door slammed in the direction Lydia fled, followed by voices too far to catch and one laugh that didn't belong to confidence anymore. And Harlan's gaze narrowed with the patience of a man who never mistakes quiet for safe. Because quiet can be a fuse, can't it? The night seemed to nod. Cole tightened his grip on resolve, and Harlan keyed the radio one last time, requesting a courtesy patrol near the HOA clubhouse. Casual language hiding a chess move, and somewhere in town a set of keys turned in a lock that believed it would keep certain people out. But locks look different when someone brings a warrant, don't they? They stood together for one more heartbeat, victory warm and thin like first light. And then Harlan said he had one more stop to make before midnight, the kind of stop that puts a tremor in a boardroom table. Because some stories don't end at the porch. They continue wherever the paper ledgers try to bury the truth. And as Cole nodded, a new vibration hummed through the quiet like a thread pulled tight. What do you call it when running turns into a summons waiting at the door? Harlan stayed after the units cleared, leaning on the kind of silence that makes truth easier to hear, and Cole finally let the adrenaline drain in sips, not gulps. Because too much relief too fast is how people trip. Harlan said charges were coming, trespass and harassment at minimum, procurement violations if the under-the-table contracts check out. And the way he said if sounded less like doubt and more like a door he already had the key for. Do you hear how certainty changes the air? Cole laughed once, the tired kind that carries months of grit, and told him Lydia only understands weight when it lands on her name. Harlan answered that names look different under oath. He warned there would be a next move, probably offstage, probably louder on paper than in person. Cole said loud on paper still cuts if you sign it. Harlan grinned without showing teeth and said that's why we bring pens of our own. How many times has paperwork saved a life after the shouting stopped? They sat, not to rest but to anchor. Cole spoke about the first storm after his dad died, how he patched the roof alone and learned the sound of water finding weakness. He said Lydia's finds felt like that drip, not a flood, just relentless. And when he found the old toolkit under the stair, he'd sworn to fix what leaks he could and fight what he couldn't reach. Harlan didn't offer comfort. He offered process. Complaints become cases. Patterns become charges. A man becomes harder to move when the ledger is on his side. Isn't that the kind of prayer neighborhoods need? A neighbor texted a grainy screenshot of an emergency board meeting. Tonight, time stamped like a dare. The subject line was sanitized, community standards review, but the tell was the rush. Harlan's eyes cooled. He said they'd try to reset the narrative before the citation team's report hit the inbox. Cole asked how many people show up when a reputation is on fire. Harlan said enough to warm their hands. If you were on that board, would you double down or step back? Cole went quiet, and then reached under the stair where he keeps almost nothing and pulled out a photo frame set face down for too long. His father stood there in older ink, one arm around a younger version of a stubborn son, both of them wearing the kind of smile that aches when you stare too long. Cole set it on the rail, like a small banner finally allowed to fly again. He told Harlan that some places are built twice, once with wood, once with memory, and memory doesn't bend for bylaws. Where do you place a picture when you want a house to remember what it's for? Harlan took a call, short words that sound like order aligning. And when he hung up, he said citations were filed electronically, service requests stamped, a patrol would make contact before midnight, documentation to follow. Lydia had run, but the paper would travel faster. Cole nodded, absorbing the calm rhythm of consequences walking in a straight line. Justice doesn't sprint. It keeps pace with the facts, and facts don't get tired, do they? Cole told a story he rarely tells, about a summer his dad couldn't make the last mortgage payment in time and still refused to borrow from neighbors because debt tastes different when friendship signs the note. He worked extra shifts and sold a motorcycle he'd rebuilt bolt by bolt. He said the bank clerk shook his hand when the receipt printed. Cole learned then that dignity is loudest when no one is watching. He said Lydia never understood that sound. Harlan said people who use rules to bruise others always forget rules can also heal. Which side of the rulebook do you want stamped on your name? A soft chirp from Harlan's radio cut the moment. Dispatch flagged that the HOA clubhouse lights were on and cars had stacked along the side street. Harlan called it a hive waking at night. Not dangerous by itself, but noisy. He told Cole to keep his phone within reach and his pulse under control, because bait works best on a racing heart. Cole smiled thin. He'd waited months for a night where restraint felt like a weapon. When did patience turn into leverage this sharp? The neighbor who'd sent the screenshot called next, voice full of nerve. He said some on the board were uneasy. A treasurer had asked whether personal liability attached to decisions made outside official process. Cole asked Harlan how often treasurers see daylight first. Harlan said money wears the thinnest skin. If the purse strings start trembling, what collapses next? Cole crafted a message he'd been too proud to send before, a short note to the neighborhood thread. If anyone has been fined without due process, if anyone was threatened off record, tonight is the moment to speak. He read it out loud and almost deleted it, then hit send. Pride bends when community needs truth. There's a strength in being seen asking for help. Would you answer that message if it landed on your phone? Replies dripped in like confession after storm. A widow recalling a notice posted at dawn. A contractor forced to rip out a ramp because it wasn't the style in Lydia's folder. A teen citing a curfew rule invented after her brother's band practiced once in a garage. Harlan listened and kept notes without drama. He said patterns are louder than stories. Cole felt his anger cool into aim. Rage wants noise. Purpose wants proof. Which one wins more often? A car rolled slow past the road again, then disappeared. Cole watched without flinching. He said Lydia would try soft power next. Whispers, character digs, calls to employers. Harlan said she could try, but the complaint file already had a spine, and bodies don't fold easily once bones are set. He rose, stretching the kind of stretch that reads readiness, then tapped the rail near the photo. He said keep that where you can see it. Reminders beat fear in the fourth quarter. When you're tired, what do you look at to remember who you are? Cole asked if showing up at the clubhouse was wise or foolish. Harlan said both, if done alone, smart if done right. He said he'd make a quick pass, not to brawl but to serve, because paperwork changes tone faster than fists. Cole offered to ride. Harlan told him to wait 10 and follow, not to pack a crowd, to pack patience. The advice tasted like steel. Does strategy ever sound gentle? Cole gathered himself in small ways that matter, locking what needed locking, settling what needed settling. He touched the frame one more time and promised the older ink that he'd be back before the late hour turned unkind. A last text pinged from an unknown number, a single line meant to rattle. See you at the vote. Cole smiled without joy. Votes count differently when the law stands in the doorway. How do you count hands when one of them is holding a subpoena? Harlan headed to his truck and paused. He told Cole that fear makes bullies fast, but accountability makes them clumsy. If they run their mouths, listen. If they run the room, watch. If they run at you, step aside and let the statute hit first. Cole answered that stepping aside tonight would feel like a dance step he'd been waiting to learn. Harlan left with the siren asleep and authority wide awake. Cole stood alone for a breath that wasn't lonely and felt the shape of the next hour press against his ribs like a drumbeat. The neighborhood thread kept blinking with stories that rhymed more than they repeated. He sent 2 words back to each one: heard and documented. It's a small phrase that does big work. Isn't that what most of us want? To be heard and documented when pressure tries to erase us. The radio on Harlan's belt, now growing small down the road, popped faintly in the night. Cole tucked the photo into a safer spot and squared his shoulders with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. A fresh buzz cut across the feed from dispatch, the kind that makes experienced men pause and civilians hold their breath. HOA board escalating to closed session, raised voices, request a unit for peacekeeping and potential service of documents. Cole locked the door with a steady hand and stepped toward his truck as the next chapter sharpened like a blade. What do you call it when a boardroom is about to learn the difference between power and permission? Cole parked a short walk from the clubhouse and let his pulse settle into something useful, because control wins hearings even when the room doesn't want to listen, right? Inside, voices tangled into a knot that sounded like blame pretending to be order. Lydia held center like a performer trying to finish the act before the lights cut, insisting Cole was dangerous, the cabin a liability, the HOA a shield against chaos, and each sentence rushed as if speed could outrun a file number. Can words outrun paper? Harlan entered without fanfare, badge forward, patience loaded, and the room shrank a size. He announced an ongoing investigation, named the statutes, placed freshly filed citations on the table like anchors, and the board stopped tapping their pens because ink looks different when it's about to sign for consequences, doesn't it? Lydia tried to fold the moment into her script, saying temporary authority allowed emergency measures. Harlan asked who voted, where, and when, and the treasurer shifted in his chair, eyes landing on a calendar that refused to lie. Cole stood at the back, silent and steady, and a few neighbors he barely knew stared with the relief of people who just realized they weren't crazy after all. Have you felt that kind of relief? Rafe slid in from the hallway, hat in his hands, jaw tight, like someone ready to pay a tab he hated. Lydia stiffened. He asked if this was the place to tell the truth. Harlan nodded once. Rafe said he'd been hired cash, no paperwork, extra if Cole left by month's end, and his voice didn't shake because sometimes shame gets calmer when it finally has a microphone, doesn't it? A board member gasped in the small way people gasp when their names might be attached to something heavy. Lydia fired back that Rafe was lying to save himself. He answered that a liar doesn't return the money he was advanced, then set an envelope on the table with bills folded flat and tight, and the sound of it landing turned the room into a witness. Can you hear how money speaks when it's tired of being hidden? The secretary cleared her throat and said minutes did not reflect any vote to seize property. Lydia snapped that informal consensus counted. The treasurer said consensus without notice feels like debt without a signature. Harlan listened like a man who's heard every version and let silence show the difference between story and record, which one travels better in front of a judge. Cole stepped forward one pace, not for drama, but gravity. He laid a simple page from his deed packet on the table corner nearest him, the name his father first, then his, clean and unbroken, and even those who disliked him stared at the ink like it could feel. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Some documents carry their own voice, don't they? Lydia lunged at the narrative, promising she would produce authority tomorrow. Harlan said the law operates today. A neighbor from Birch stood up with shaking hands and told the room about a fine that arrived after a medical leave, a fee that ballooned until he sold tools to keep up. Another neighbor described being told to remove a ramp for style. The pattern started to stack like bricks around Lydia's shoes. How high does a pattern have to rise before it becomes a wall? The vice president asked Lydia to pause and let counsel review. Lydia barked that leadership requires courage. The vice president answered that courage isn't the same as ignoring a badge. The treasurer whispered a question about personal liability and insurance exclusions, and you could feel the air thin where the word personal touched the word liability. Have you watched a room learn a new vocabulary in under a minute? Rafe added one more cut, saying he'd been instructed to block Cole even if he showed proof of ownership. Lydia hissed that he was misremembering. Rafe stared at the tabletop like it could absolve him and said he'd recorded the instructions to cover himself, and 3 little words rewired the night. I have audio. What happens to a story when a tape starts breathing? Harlan accepted a phone Rafe slid over and cued a clip that caught Lydia directing a hold at the porch with a hard edge no memo could polish. Multiple heads bowed as if ducking a blow they didn't deserve. The secretary closed her eyes. The treasurer asked if that meant their defense just fell through the floor. Harlan said it meant they'd reach the truth faster, and sometimes fast is mercy, isn't it? The vice president moved a motion for emergency leadership review. 2 hands went up, then 3, then 4, each one trembling less than the last. Lydia screamed that coups don't count. Cole finally spoke, not loud, not cruel, just clear, saying coups happen in the dark, but votes happen in the light, and the light right now was unforgiving. Whose side does daylight take when it has to choose? Harlan delivered the formal notice. Lydia to appear, charges detailed, violations listed, dates fixed. He placed the packet in front of her the way doctors place test results on a bed rail. Lydia's face went through every season in a breath and then hardened into winter. She spat promises of countersuits. The treasurer said insurance won't cover intentional acts. The secretary asked if resignation would help the board survive. Lydia's chair scraped the floor like a warning shot. What do you do when you're allergic to accountability? Cole looked at the neighbors that had written back to his message, saw fear turning to something with a spine, and made a quiet invitation. If anyone had been threatened, he would collect statements and share council numbers. 3 people nodded, then 2 more. The room's center of gravity drifted away from the white suit toward the stack of forms and the man who didn't raise his voice. Where does leadership live when charisma expires? Harlan told the board the fastest way forward was cooperation. He told Lydia the slowest way forward was hers. She stood so quickly that her chair toppled and didn't bother to pick it up. She told the room they were ungrateful and would miss her when rules disappeared. Cole answered that rules don't disappear. They just stop being used as weapons. The vice president whispered thanks to Harlan like a prayer finding words. Do you remember the last time relief made your hands shake? Rafe backed away from the table, lighter by the weight of a confession delivered. He met Cole's eyes and gave the smallest nod. Not friendship, not forgiveness, just an acknowledgement that grown men can choose better on the second try. Cole returned it, because neighborhoods are built on second tries more than first victories, aren't they? Lydia gathered her bag, grabbed the notice with a grip that looked ready to tear it, then realized tearing wouldn't change the copy already in the system. She shot a look at Cole that promised noise. Harlan shifted his stance just enough to remind her the night still had a sheriff. The door opened to a corridor suddenly too narrow for her anger, and she pushed through like a storm that had run out of sky. What happens when wind finds no sails? Cole waited 3 breaths and followed, not to chase but to finish. The board murmured behind him, a sound like scaffolding finally touching ground. Harlan fell in step with a calm that said everything important was already written down. Outside, footsteps echoed ahead, quick and unsteady, and a car door thudded open with the desperation of someone trying to outrun ink. Cole stepped into the night with resolve sharpened into something surgical, because some endings refuse walls and prefer open air, and just beyond the lot Lydia turned, eyes bright with the last spark of a fight she couldn't afford to lose, ready to swing words like broken glass as Harlan closed the distance, and the final choice snapped into view. What do you call the breath right before a storm learns it isn't weather anymore? It's evidence. Lydia spun at the edge of the lot, fury bright and shaking, hurling blame like handfuls of nails while Harlan closed the gap with the calm of a man who already filed the finish, and Cole stopped 3 paces back, steady as a verdict that learned patience the hard way. Because what else do you call a moment when noise runs out of breath? Harlan read the notice line by line. Removal pending, criminal counts referred, service confirmed, and the words did what shouting never could. They rearranged the ground under Lydia's shoes until even her anger had to find somewhere else to stand. And for the first time all night her eyes flickered like someone hearing their own echo. Can you feel a crown slip without touching it? She tried to buy time with promises that tomorrow would fix the paperwork, that the board would rally, that neighbors would beg for her rules when order fell apart. But order stared back from the badge and didn't blink, and Cole said softly that rules never needed a queen to exist. Only consent, only fairness, only people willing to look each other in the eye. When did leadership confuse permission with possession? Rafe hovered 5 yards off like a man who finally paid the tab and didn't want change, nodding once toward Cole as if returning a tool he'd borrowed too long. And Harlan told him to expect a call for a statement, that owning the truth early saves weight later. And Rafe exhaled something that might one day become peace. How heavy does a pocket feel when you stop hiding what's inside it? Lydia stepped in close to Cole and aimed for the soft places, calling him small, calling the cabin an obsession, calling the past a crutch, and he answered without flinching that a man who keeps a promise to a father isn't trapped by yesterday. He's escorted by it. And the words landed with a thud even her anger couldn't kick back up. What promise have you kept long enough to change your posture? A door opened somewhere behind them. 2 board members slipped out quiet-eyed, the vice president and the treasurer, carrying the tired look of people who finally stopped borrowing someone else's voice. And they told Harlan they would cooperate fully and schedule an open vote under council. and the way they said open sounded like fresh air after a long hallway. When did transparency learn to breathe again? Lydia reached for one last lever and threatened to drown them in filings, to smear coal on every thread, to turn neighbors against neighbors until the street forgot how to wave. And Harlan said the first to file, when they're wrong, only helps the record. And Cole said the street remembers faster than lies can travel now that everyone is awake. How fast can a rumor run without legs? Her expression hardened into something younger and meaner, the old certainty spitting sparks as she jabbed a finger toward Cole and promised he would hate the bill for fighting her. And he smiled without joy and said the only bill he pays tonight is the one he owed to his father. And Harlan stepped between them with a quiet that turned the volume down to truth. How many decibels does dignity need? A patrol unit rolled by for the service log, clipped their names, confirmed the packet, and the clipboard made every second feel stamped. And when the pen lifted, the moment changed species, from drama to consequence, from storm to record. And Lydia seemed to feel it crawl across her skin as she yanked open her car door and hissed that they hadn't seen the last of her. What shape does a threat take when paper is already ahead of it? She left in a rush that didn't look like victory, taillights biting the dark, and silence settled with weight, but not fear. And the vice president apologized to Cole in the voice of a neighbor who had been waiting months to say sorry right. And Cole told him to use the next meeting to repair more than rules, to repair trust, because bylaws without neighbors aren't communities, they're chores. When did apology become a tool instead of a confession? Harlan clapped Rafe on the shoulder and told him to go home, to be ready to sign what he said. And Rafe said he would and asked Cole low if there'd ever be a day they shook hands without history between them. And Cole said maybe not soon, but soon enough if he kept choosing better. And Rafe nodded like a man measuring a ladder he finally learned to climb. How far is the first rung from the ground when pride stops kicking? They drove back without sirens, and the road felt honest. And at the porch, Harlan handed Cole a card for a victim's advocate who helps with retaliation cases. Said call if the whisper games start. Said the quiet fights bruise slower but deeper. And Cole tucked the card next to the old toolkit like a spare fuse. Because backups are another word for care. What's the smartest thing you've ever kept within reach? They talked a minute more. Not about law, but about staying human when the paperwork ends. And Harlan said he learned long ago to mark the wins without letting them eat the next day. And Cole said he'd try. And the sheriff smiled with tired eyes and rolled out with a tap of the brim that carried more blessing than goodbye. How do professionals make kindness look like standard procedure? Cole stood alone and breathed the feeling of a house returning to its owner, not as territory, but as story. And he lifted the frame again, the old photograph steady in his hands. And he told the man inside the glass that the promise survived, that bullies lost, that stubbornness was worth it when it protected something that couldn't defend itself. What do you say to the person who taught you how to stand? He set the frame on the rail and felt a small resistance under his palm, an envelope tucked where it hadn't been before, slim and neat, and his name written in block letters that tried too hard to look calm. And he slid the paper out and read the single line that chilled because it smiled while it cut. This isn't the last time you'll see me. And he looked up at the road where taillights had been a minute ago and let the words sort themselves into tomorrow's list. Do you feel how a threat shrinks once it has to live next to a file number? He pocketed the note for evidence and locked the door with a firmness that sounded like a vow. And then he lit a small lamp on the table because darkness is honest, but light is useful. And he sat with the weight of the night turning from heat to cool. And he texted the neighbors who had shared their stories with 2 words he'd promised to keep sending: heard and documented. And one by one hearts blinked back like windows finding their switches. When a street starts answering each other again, what can a bully even sell? Cole smiled once, the kind you only get after choosing steady over loud. And he let himself be tired without feeling defeated. And somewhere in town, a board calendar updated itself with an open vote and a new chair. And somewhere else, an attorney's inbox received a packet that didn't care about charisma. And the next chapter began where this one was always meant to end, in a neighborhood that finally remembered its own name. And as the lamp hummed, and the frame watched, and the note in his pocket cooled into evidence, he said a quiet promise to the room that raised him back up. If they ever come again, they will find a door that hangs true. And the night held that sentence like a key, ready to turn when needed. Are you ready to see what happens when a community refuses to forget?